My name is June Waverly, and I'm 61 years old. If you're just starting to watch this story now, I need you to take a deep breath because what I'm about to share with you is something I never thought could happen in my own home, under my own roof, to the person I'd spent years protecting. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and the kind of cruelty that hides behind a familiar smile at the breakfast table. This is about my father, the man who raised me, and the husband I thought I knew after decades of marriage. I live in a quiet town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where neighbors wave from their porches and everyone knows your name. I taught elementary school for 30 years before I retired 5 years ago. My husband Tom is 64, and he runs the local hardware store on Main Street. We've been married for 38 years. We raised 2 children in our modest 2-story house with the blue shutters and the garden I tend every spring. For the past year, my father Harold Waverly has lived with us. He's 87 now, and after he had a stroke last winter, he couldn't manage living alone anymore. My brother lives in California and couldn't take him in, so Tom and I made the decision together, or so I thought. We converted our guest room into Dad's bedroom, brought his favorite recliner, his radio, the photographs he loved. Those first few months were good. We'd share coffee every morning at the kitchen table, the 3 of us. Dad would tell stories about when I was little, about my mother before she passed 20 years ago. Tom would laugh along, pat Dad's shoulder, ask him questions about the old days. In the afternoons, Dad and I would sit in the living room and listen to the radio together. He loved the old music stations, the ones that played songs from the 40s and 50s. Sometimes he'd hum along, tapping his fingers on the armrest of his chair. I thought we were all safe under one roof. I thought we were a family taking care of each other the way families should. But I was wrong. It started so small I almost didn't notice it. Dad's speech began to slur more often than it had right after the stroke. He'd stumble over simple words, struggle to finish sentences. I told myself it was just his age, that recovery wasn't always linear. But then he started getting groggy during the day, nodding off in his chair even after a full night's sleep. He'd wake up confused, disoriented, asking what time it was, where he was. Then came the fear. Dad started mentioning things that didn't make sense. He said he heard footsteps in his room at night, whispers he couldn't quite make out. Once, he grabbed my hand and said someone had been standing over his bed in the dark. I told him it was just dreams, confusion from his medication. But deep down, something felt wrong. I started paying closer attention. I noticed Tom had been leaving our bedroom every night around midnight. He'd slip out quietly, and when I'd wake up and ask where he was going, he'd say he needed water or had trouble sleeping. It happened so regularly I started expecting it. One night, I pretended to be asleep and listened to his footsteps going down the hall. They stopped outside Dad's room. I heard the door creak open, then close. My heart started pounding. What was he doing in there? The next morning at breakfast, I watched Tom carefully. He was cheerful, talking about a customer at the hardware store, buttering his toast like nothing unusual had happened. Dad was quiet, pushing his oatmeal around his bowl. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. When Tom left for work, I asked Dad how he'd slept. He just shook his head slowly and said he couldn't remember. Then one Tuesday morning, I found it. I was vacuuming the living room, moving around Dad's recliner, when I spotted something on the carpet near the leg of the chair. A pill. Half crushed, white, with markings I didn't recognize. I picked it up carefully and stared at it. Dad took medication for his blood pressure and his heart, but this didn't look like any of his pills. I wrapped it in a tissue and put it in my pocket. When Tom came home that evening, I showed it to him. I asked if he knew what it was, if maybe Dad had dropped one of his medications. Tom barely glanced at it. He laughed, a light dismissive sound, and said I worried too much. He told me it was probably nothing, maybe something that fell out of someone's pocket when we had visitors. But we hadn't had visitors in weeks. And something about the way Tom avoided looking at me made my stomach turn. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Tom, listening to him breathe, watching the ceiling fan turn slowly in the darkness. Around midnight, just like clockwork, he slipped out of bed. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. I heard his footsteps pad down the hallway. I heard Dad's door open with that familiar creak. And then I heard voices. Low, muffled, but definitely voices. Tom's voice and Dad's, though Dad sounded weak, confused. I wanted to get up, to go see what was happening, but fear kept me frozen in place. What if I was imagining things? What if there was a reasonable explanation and I just embarrassed myself by barging in? After about 10 minutes, I heard Dad's door close again. Tom's footsteps came back down the hall. He slipped into bed beside me like nothing had happened. The next morning, Dad looked worse than I'd ever seen him. His hands shook as he tried to lift his coffee cup. He could barely keep his eyes open. When I asked if he was feeling all right, he just stared at me with this look I'll never forget. It was fear. Pure fear. But when I asked what was wrong, he shook his head and wouldn't answer. Tom sat across from us, reading the newspaper, calm as anything. At one point, he glanced at Dad and muttered under his breath, something I almost didn't catch. He said, "He's useless. She spends too much time on him." I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Had I heard that right? I looked at Tom, but he was back to reading his paper like he hadn't said anything at all. My mind raced. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe he was talking about something else, someone at the store. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening in my house, right under my nose. Over the next few days, I found more evidence. Another pill on the floor near Dad's room. Dad's medication bottle seemed off, like pills were missing that shouldn't be. Dad became more withdrawn, barely speaking, jumping at sudden sounds. And every single night, Tom left our bed at midnight. I started marking it on the calendar in my mind. Midnight. Every night. Like clockwork. One evening, I worked up the courage to ask Tom directly. I said, "You've been getting up every night. Is something wrong? Are you not sleeping well?" He looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. Then he smiled and said he'd just been having trouble with indigestion lately, that he didn't want to keep me awake with his tossing and turning. It sounded reasonable. But it felt like a lie. That's when I knew I had to do something. I couldn't confront Tom without proof. If I accused him of something and I was wrong, it would destroy our marriage. But if I was right, if something awful was happening to my father, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I fought with the guilt for days. The idea of spying on my own husband felt like a betrayal, like I was the one doing something wrong. But every time I looked at Dad, saw how scared and confused he'd become, I knew I didn't have a choice. I had to know the truth. So one afternoon, when Tom was at the store and Dad was napping, I drove to an electronics shop 2 towns over. I didn't want anyone local to know what I was buying. I told the young man working there that I needed a security camera for my home. He showed me several options. I picked a small one, motion activated, with night vision capability. It was disguised to look like a smoke detector. He said it could record for hours and save everything to a memory card. It cost me $180. I paid in cash. I didn't want it showing up on our joint credit card statement where Tom might see it. I drove home with the camera in a bag on my passenger seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I got home, Dad was still asleep and Tom wasn't back yet. I went upstairs and stood outside Dad's bedroom door for a long moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I went inside. The room was quiet, just the sound of Dad's gentle snoring from down the hall in the living room where he'd fallen asleep in his recliner. I looked around for the best place to install the camera. It needed a clear view of Dad's bed, but it couldn't be obvious. I finally decided on the spot just above the doorframe. The ceiling was white, and the camera looked exactly like a small smoke detector. Unless you were looking for it, you'd never notice it. My hands shook as I stood on a chair and mounted it carefully, adjusting the angle. I turned it on, set it to motion-activated recording, and climbed down. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. This tiny device that would either prove my fears were unfounded or confirm my worst nightmare. Then I left the room and tried to go about my day like everything was normal. Tom came home around 6. We had dinner, the 3 of us, mostly in silence. Dad barely touched his food. Tom talked about a problem with a supplier at the store. I nodded along, barely hearing him. That night, I couldn't eat. My stomach was in knots. After dinner, we all watched television for a while in the living room. At 9 o'clock, Dad said he was tired and wanted to go to bed. I helped him up the stairs, made sure he had everything he needed. I kissed his forehead and told him to sleep well. He looked at me with those tired, frightened eyes and squeezed my hand. Then I closed his door and went back downstairs. Tom and I watched the news together, then went to bed ourselves around 11. I lay there in the darkness, wide awake, listening to every sound. My heart was pounding so hard I thought Tom might hear it. At midnight, just like I knew he would, Tom slipped out of bed. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady and slow. I heard him leave the room, heard his footsteps in the hallway. I heard Dad's door open. And I knew the camera was recording everything. I don't know how long I lay there. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 15 minutes before Tom came back to bed. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just waited for morning. As soon as Tom left for work the next day, I went straight to Dad's room. He was still sleeping, exhausted as always. I climbed up on the chair and carefully removed the camera. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I took it to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. I pulled the memory card out and plugged it into my laptop. The video player opened. There was one file, time-stamped from 12:18 a.m. I took a deep breath and clicked play. At first, it was just Dad sleeping. The night vision gave everything a greenish glow. I could see his chest rising and falling peacefully under the blankets. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 12:18, according to the timestamp, the door opened. Tom walked into the room. He was wearing his pajamas, moving quietly, carefully. He walked over to Dad's bed and stood there for a moment, looking down at him. I watched, my heart in my throat. What was he doing? Then Tom reached down and shook Dad's shoulder. Not gently. Hard. Dad woke up, confused, disoriented. I couldn't hear what they were saying clearly. The camera's audio wasn't great, but I could see Dad's face. I saw the fear there. Immediate fear. Dad tried to sit up, but Tom pushed him back down onto the pillow. Then Tom reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A pill bottle. He shook out a pill, maybe two, I couldn't tell from the angle. He filled a glass of water from the pitcher on Dad's nightstand and held it out. Dad shook his head, tried to refuse, but Tom grabbed his jaw. I watched in horror as my husband forced my father to swallow those pills. Dad was crying, silent tears running down his face. Then Tom leaned close to Dad's face and started talking to him. I turned up the volume on my laptop as high as it would go, straining to hear. I caught fragments. Burden, Tom said. Ruining everything. Then, clearer than anything else, I heard him say, "You don't deserve her taking care of you. You're just dead weight." Those words burned into my brain. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Tom stood there for another minute, saying things I couldn't fully make out, while Dad just lay there crying, too weak and confused to fight back. Then Tom turned and left the room. On the video, I watched Dad curl up on his side, his whole body shaking with sobs. I watched him cry alone in the dark for 10 minutes before he finally fell asleep, probably from whatever pills Tom had forced down his throat. I closed the laptop. I sat there on my bed, unable to move, unable to think. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Tom, my husband of 38 years. Tom, who'd been a good father to our children. Tom, who I'd built a life with. But it was real. I just watched it happen. And suddenly everything made sense. The grogginess, the fear, Dad's deteriorating condition. Tom had been drugging him. Abusing him. Every single night when he thought I was asleep. How long had this been going on? Weeks? Months? I felt sick. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. When I came back, I saved the video file to 3 different places, my computer, a USB drive, and I emailed it to myself. Then I sat down and tried to think clearly. I couldn't confront Tom directly. If I did, he'd deny everything, destroy any other evidence, maybe even hurt Dad worse. I needed help. Professional help. I picked up my phone and called our family doctor, Dr. Patterson. I told him I needed to bring Dad in immediately, that I suspected he was being abused. Dr. Patterson's voice became very serious. He told me to bring Dad in that afternoon, that he'd make time. I helped Dad get dressed and told him we were going to see the doctor for a checkup. He didn't argue. He seemed relieved to be leaving the house. In Dr. Patterson's office, I explained everything while Dad sat quietly in the exam chair. I told the doctor about the pills I'd found, about Dad's symptoms, about Tom's nightly visits. Then I showed him the video on my phone. Dr. Patterson watched it, his face getting harder with each second. When it ended, he looked at me and said, "June, this is elder abuse. This is criminal. I'm a mandatory reporter, which means I have to report this to the authorities." I nodded. I'd expected that. I wanted him to. He examined Dad thoroughly, checking his vital signs, looking for any signs of injury. He asked Dad gentle questions about how he'd been feeling, whether anyone had been hurting him. Dad broke down. He told Dr. Patterson everything. About Tom coming to his room every night, forcing him to take pills that made him sleep all day, saying cruel things to him, threatening him. Dad said he'd been too scared to tell me because Tom had warned him that if he said anything, he'd be sent away to a nursing home where no one would care about him. Dr. Patterson documented everything carefully. Then he made a phone call right there from his office. Within an hour, 2 police officers arrived at the clinic. They were professional, gentle with Dad. They took our statements, mine and Dad's. They watched the video I'd saved. They looked at Dr. Patterson's notes. One of them, Officer Monroe, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, said to me, "Mrs. Waverly, we're going to go to your house and arrest your husband. We need you and your father to come to the station to give formal statements. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at Dad sitting in the clinic chair. He looked so small, so frail, but for the first time in weeks, there was something like hope in his eyes. I took his hand and said, "Yes, we're ready." The police went to my house first. They had me call Tom and ask him to come home, saying there was an emergency. He arrived 20 minutes later. I don't know exactly what happened when they arrested him, I wasn't there. But Officer Monroe told me later that Tom denied everything at first. He said I was crazy, that Dad was senile and making things up, that I'd manipulated the whole situation. But when they showed him the video, told him about Dr. Patterson's medical documentation, he went quiet. They arrested him right there in our living room. They charged him with elder abuse, assault, forcible confinement, and administering a noxious substance. They took him to the police station, processed him, held him in custody. Meanwhile, Dad and I were at a different station giving our statements. It took hours. The officers were patient with Dad, gentle when he got confused or emotional. They asked me about the timeline, about when I first noticed something was wrong, about buying and installing the camera. By the time we finished, it was evening. Officer Monroe drove us home. The house felt different without Tom there. Empty. Cold. But also, for the first time in months, safe. I made Dad some soup for dinner. We ate in silence, both of us exhausted, both of us trying to process what had just happened. Before bed, Dad took my hand and said, "Thank you, June. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for saving me." I started crying. I told him I was sorry, so sorry I hadn't seen it sooner, hadn't protected him better. He shook his head and said, "You stopped it. That's what matters." The legal process that followed was long and painful. Tom was released on bail with a no-contact order, meaning he couldn't come near Dad or me. He moved in with his brother in another town. I filed for divorce immediately. Tom fought me on everything. His lawyer tried to claim the video was illegally obtained, that I'd violated his privacy. But my attorney shut that down fast. You can't claim privacy when you're committing crimes. The criminal trial happened 4 months later. The prosecutor was a sharp woman named Victoria Holmes who treated Dad with so much respect throughout the whole ordeal. She presented the video in court, showed Dr. Patterson's medical documentation, called Dad to testify. Dad was brave. Despite his confusion and fear, he told the truth about what Tom had done to him. I testified too, about what I'd observed, about finding the pills, about installing the camera. Tom's defense lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive. He claimed I'd manipulated Dad against Tom, that the video was taken out of context. But how do you take elder abuse out of context? The jury saw through it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced Tom to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. He'd never be allowed to work with vulnerable people again. He'd have a criminal record for the rest of his life. Our divorce was finalized while he was serving his sentence. I got the house. I didn't want anything else from him, just distance. Dad lived with me for another 8 months after the trial. His physical health improved once the drugging stopped. He gained back the weight he'd lost, seemed more alert, started smiling again. But the emotional trauma took longer to heal. He had nightmares. He'd wake up scared, thinking Tom was in the house. We got him into therapy, specialized counseling for abuse victims. Slowly, he started to recover. But his age and the stroke caught up with him eventually. By that fall, he needed more medical care than I could provide at home. We found a wonderful assisted living facility right here in town, a place that specializes in stroke recovery and elder care. The staff there are incredible, attentive, kind, vigilant. I visit Dad every single day. Some days he's sharp and we talk about old times. Some days he's confused and doesn't quite remember what happened with Tom. But he's safe. He's cared for. He's never afraid. I'm 61 now, divorced, living alone in a house that feels too big. My children know what happened. They were horrified, supportive, angry at their father. They visit more often now, checking on me and their grandfather. People in town know too. Word got out during the trial. Some people whisper, some people avoid me at the grocery store. But others have come forward to tell me similar stories, to thank me for speaking up, to say they wish they'd had the courage to act when they suspected abuse in their own families. Tom got out of prison 4 months ago. I don't know where he is now. I don't care. He's not allowed to contact me or Dad. Sometimes I think about the 38 years we spent together and wonder if there were signs I missed earlier. But it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I trusted my instincts. I saw the signs even when I didn't want to believe them. I took action even when it meant destroying my marriage and my life as I knew it. I protected my father when he couldn't protect himself. I'm sharing this story because elder abuse is real. It happens in homes that look normal from the outside. It happens to people who can't always speak up for themselves, who are vulnerable and dependent on others for care. And it's often done by people we trust, people we love, people we'd never suspect. If you notice an elderly person showing unexplained bruises, fear of certain people, sudden changes in behavior or health, please don't ignore it. Ask questions. Investigate. Trust your gut. Document everything. Talk to doctors, lawyers, police. Build evidence. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it might destroy relationships. But a vulnerable person's safety is worth more than keeping the peace. My father is safe now. I sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. Love doesn't mean doubting your eyes to protect someone else's lies. If something feels wrong, act. Don't wait. Someone's life might depend on it.